welcome everyone to today's webinar for the SEND Centre for Excellence. We're delighted to welcome Nick Elston here today. Thank you, Nick, for joining us. As most of you are probably already aware, the SEND Centre for Excellence is one of 3 centres in the UK, and our focus at Weston is people. So a lot of what we've been doing over the past year has been around SEND and also people focus, so managing anxiety, mental health, and also promoting well-being amongst staff and learners. Before I hand over to Nick, I thought it would be helpful to just share with you some of the statistics that we found just in COVID alone around take-up of courses. As you can see on the screen there, the top one out of 674 enrolments has been around mental health problems, and also then 70 enrolments on the understanding people with mental health problems. So, you know, the picture is very much that this is at the forefront of people's minds. It was prior to COVID, but obviously with COVID it's increased significantly. And recently there was a statistic released to say that if the impact of COVID-19 is similar to that of the 2008 recession, it is anticipated that another 500,000 people will suffer from mental health and anxiety over the coming year, which I think is actually quite frightening. If any of you haven't already seen it, Mind UK sent or distributed a report the week before last around the mental health emergency as a result of COVID-19, and that's a really interesting read. We will put information that we talk about today in a email to you all, along with a link to the recording, and I'll also drop that link to that survey in there, because I think it is really important that we're all fully informed in terms of what the impact is and continues to be of COVID-19. Before I hand over to Nick, just to give you a quick overview, and we did do a mental health webinar on the 3rd of June. So again, I'll send the link to that in the follow-up email. But we talked about the support services that we as an organisation have put in place to support both learners and staff. And on the screen there's just a little sort of introduction to some of the platforms and resources and tools that we have as an organisation. And obviously, as I say, we ran a webinar on the 3rd of June, and we can talk to you in more detail about sort of the wider support that we offer. But part of that work, we held a mental health conference on the 5th of March, and we had 420 people attend that. We were really lucky that Nick attended that conference, and I think, well, I don't know what percentage, but a high percentage of attendees wrote on the feedback form that he stood out and he was like the star of the day. So we are delighted that Nick's agreed to join and run this webinar for us this afternoon. I don't think I need to say any more. I shall hand over to Nick.
Thanks, Jane. Absolutely no pressure at all.
Actually, I should just say, there we are. I should just say, Nick's happy to take questions at the end of the presentation.
Yes.
So use the chat function, pop any questions in, any comments, any sort of observations, or anything that you might want to follow up with Nick, because either we can send your contact details to Nick after this or put you in contact, but he's willing to take questions at the end of the session. So thank you. Nick, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Jane. Great to see you all here. Wow, a nice kind of real collection of different people from different walks of life within this as well. So great to see you and great to be back. I love working with Weston College. I do lots of different things. I've emceed for them for their awards dinner. I've helped with classes of students and as Jane said, spoken at events as well. It's a real pleasure to be here. So for those who have not met before, so my name is Nick Elston. I'm an inspirational speaker on the lived experience of mental health. And not that really weird, beefy title. The lived experience part is the most important part for you guys to understand. Lived experience, as I see it, is the vehicle that takes organizations and individuals from the problem of mental health challenges to the solution, but it's not the solution. So actually, by going in and delivering talks to universities, to colleges, to schools, but also to corporates and to prisons and all the other things that I get into, I'm actually just signposting. I'm increasing engagement in the wellbeing initiatives and the mental health initiatives you have in place already. Because actually what I find is the biggest challenge is that you can have every single initiative under the sun, but unless you get the engagement, absolutely nothing changes. So for me, I found that sharing my story and sharing my experiences and the way that I deliver that increases engagement. It gives people permission to buy in, to share, and to open up about their own challenges. And I'll give you a real snapshot of that this afternoon, kind of roughly how I do those kind of things, by engaging you to consider things that your own lives, personally and professionally, because even though we're in a professional environment right now, actually the essential tools to know that to be happy and strong in the workplace, you need to be happy and strong in yourself. So actually this is ultimately about self-care, and I'll come on to that very shortly. If you're on social media, I use the hashtag Talk and Anxiety to follow my journeys. And if you can go to the next slide, Jane, great, thank you. So just to give you some context and background, actually this picture in the background was taken at the event that Jane was just talking about, an amazing event. Really pleased to be and proud to be part of that. So I work with lots of different global media outlets. I work with BBC namely, but also lots of different organisations where I deliver the lived experience angle when it comes to mental health and mental illness, and actually clearly defining the difference between mental illness and mental health, which I'll come on to shortly. I'm a mental health first aider, but really I did that just to increase my understanding and my knowledge of other mental health conditions. I'm a Time to Change mental health champion, but also signpost to lots of different organisations, people like Student Minds and Mind and Mental Health UK, lots of different things I'm an ambassador for. I'm actually the agony uncle for Accounting Web as well, go figure. Who thought that was going to be a thing? So I've got 50,000 anxious accountants writing to me every month, which is interesting, should we say the least. And the interesting thing is I deliver this talk and the series of talks that I deliver all over the world. The real problem we have in the UK is that we generationally and culturally consider self-care as selfish. So therefore, we will automatically give ourselves away to help other people, to help other situations, which actually could be noble. But interestingly, unless you start to look after yourself, you haven't got the power and the strength to go and look after other people. It's like the airplane adage that you need to put your oxygen mask on first to be able to help everybody else. And I think that's a real challenge when it comes to convincing people to take those steps to look after themselves. Next slide, please, Jane. So I throw this one in just because my business, Forging People, it came from a line in my talk that in life, we either let our adversities and our challenges define us negatively for the rest of our days, or we choose for it to forge something powerful. We choose for it to forge something beautiful, something that never would have existed without you going through your stuff in the first place. And for me, that's kind of where it all starts to make sense, that actually it makes sense of the challenges that I've been through to get to the point where I am today, helping other people to ignite them to do something with that energy, because it takes the same level of energy to destroy us as it does as a catalyst to go forward. And I think that actually, essentially, people just want to have that point of hope, but I'll come on to that very shortly. The way that I deliver stuff is around emotional storytelling. So again, when I deliver this in an educational environment, it's actually around confidence, it's around resilience, it's about kind of team building sometimes, but actually how do you sound when you deliver emotion? And it's an important question to ask yourself as well, because if you don't know how to deliver any message, whether that should be to one person or whether it be to a room full of people, if you cannot deliver your message, your opinion with clarity and with power and emotion, then actually that you're not truly living a life on your terms. And for me, that's kind of where I saw myself at and where things have changed now. Next slide, please, Jane. Thank you. But above being a husband, a brother, a son, or any other of my roles in life, I'm dad to this Shih Tzu. My most important role in life. She's the one on the left as I see it, by the way. You can't tell the difference a great deal because of the beard coming back, but there we go. And this is Tula. She's my little girl, and she's currently been very good, so I'm going to keep my voice down a little bit to make sure she doesn't wake up and bark. Next slide, please, Jane. Thank you. And this is my best Pavarotti impression. It's not bad, eh? So for me, I need to share a little bit about my story, a little bit about my journey, and it's purely as context. And I think it's when people lose context, they lose everything. You see that at the heart of any form of broken down relationship, whether that be personally or professionally, when we lose the context of where somebody comes from, that we cannot really engage with what they're trying to tell us, with what they're trying to showcase to us, or maybe in your instances, maybe what you're trying to teach people. Unless they get you, if you show a bit of yourself, then you can start to engage with what they're saying. And for the way that I deliver stuff, as you know, this is going to be very different to a wellbeing class or a mental health class because of the way that I like to deliver what I deliver. So a little bit about my story as background, but this isn't like an X Factor sob story. Coldplay aren't going to walk in and play Fix You in the background or anything like that. Is that we have this thing that we think that broken people come from broken environments, and actually that can absolutely be true, but also can absolutely not be true as well. That I come from and came from a loving family, a loving upbringing, but stuff still goes wrong along the way. And in my childhood, I had obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. I'm 42 now. I've had a hard life. But even at 42, the treatment was not as it may be now. The awareness wasn't as high as it may be now. So what it left me with, because it wasn't properly addressed, was something called generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, which that's kind of what it morphed into, because things that were given to me to support the OCD diagnosis were things like talking therapy, which I love. I love talking therapy. I think it's powerful, but not for that. So it took away some of the compulsion, some of the obsession. What it left me with was something, as I said, called GAD, which is less commonly known, but statistically more common, interestingly. And signs of that in adult life. And when I start to read these, that it really does resonate with people, that we can carry this stuff without even recognizing it sometimes. So signs of GAD in adult life could be that you constantly replay conversations and events that have gone wrong or not the way you wanted them to, and you kind of ruminate and you keep on playing those things over and over, and maybe try and repurpose that. But you're on that hamster wheel of anxiety that you just cannot stop. And as soon as one thing ends, something else jumps straight back in. It could be that you have increased sensitivity or hypersensitivity, where you become defensive or angry about things that wouldn't warrant that level of defense or anger. It could be that you seek your worth or your accountability or your value as a human being in the hands and the opinions of other people, because actually we don't feel strong enough and confident enough to be able to have that belief in ourselves. So really that's what I try to talk about. I don't talk about what anxiety is to an extent. I leave that to the professionals. What I talk about is what anxiety does and how it affects the decisions we take, how it affects the opportunities we go for and the ones we don't, how it affects the relationships we choose and the ones we choose to stay in, how it affects the careers we decide to pursue. Lots of different things, but the whole thing is that it keeps us in a comfort zone. It stops us living a life on our terms. And for me, this is what I think differentiates the mental illness element to the mental health element. And having experienced both, mental health is the bit that I try and positively impact. To give people, to give students, to give prisoners, to give whoever I'm speaking to, tools and tips and techniques, stuff that worked for me along the way, that actually when practiced daily incremental changes, you can start to have a real positive impact, because everybody has mental health. It's just a case of how strong or maybe how weak it can be sometimes, and recognizing that that can ebb and flow. What do we do when we need to manage our state? Interestingly, in lockdown, most of the people that I've spoken to who have had mental health challenges have been able to manage this a lot more effectively than people that are new to isolation and anxiety and loneliness. That because they have the processes in place to be able to manage their state, the behaviors and the tools and all the things that there are to actually start to manage our state and how we feel, they can use those things. But people that are new to this are really struggling right now. So again, you take away that assumption too. Anyway, back to the story. My way of dealing with that was actually, if you look at school, and it's a great kind of thing to drop in, especially with you guys today. If you look at education, school be quite a brutal environment when you are struggling with low self-esteem and low self-confidence anyway. You throw in a healthy dose of OCD traits and generalized anxiety disorder. Interestingly, though, I was considered successful, that I had top grades in every class. I was head prefect in every school I was at. I was in every clique. Interestingly, that's the problem, is that we give ourselves a way to appease other people and situations, and we end up forming that kind of relationship of people pleasing very early as a survival mechanism. But also interestingly, and I do a lot of work and I speak a lot about conditioning and about labels. That if I think about as you probably worked out by now, I'm brutally honest about this stuff. So if you look at my 3 biggest challenges in adult life, firstly, there's anxiety. That there's a family history of anxiety, and it's a learned behaviour for me. And it's basically not done through any cruel intent or any lack of love. I've got a loving family, but actually it's a learned behaviour. My reaction to things is very highly anxious. The second element was that if my relationship with food and body image, I'm a 6'4", 20-odd stone guy. So I've built a brand on it now, so I'm kind of screwed. But the point is that in between feeding me rounds of sandwiches, and as much as I love them and miss them every day, my grandparents would say he's a big lad, he loves his food. I am a big lad, I love my food. I've associated that with a really strong, comfortable, happy place in my life. And actually, that's the reason why it's been hard to break down. But it's also interesting the stuff that we do carry that we don't even recognize. And I'm not ashamed to say I've got a bad relationship with alcohol. But I only realized when I stopped, and this wasn't a distant thing, this was last year, that I was rushed into hospital at the start of last year. And the doctor said, Mr. Elston, you've got a big heart. I said, thank you very much. He said, no, it's not a good thing. Well, okay, cool, fair enough. But the medication that they put me on to correct that, and basically I couldn't drink, long story short, or if I did, it would impact the course of the medication. So I just thought, okay, I'll stop drinking. And I wasn't, and I'm not an alcoholic, and that's important to throw in as well, that I would go weeks without drinking, but actually what I found was that firstly, people were saying how much I've changed on nights out, how much I've changed in terms of my behavior, in terms of temper and aggression. Not that I was ever highly aggressive, but be quick to turn if I've had a drink. If I'd had a bad day, if I had 1 pint, I wanted 10. If I had a great day, if I had 1 pint, I wanted 10. It's a drinking with intent. But again, I carried that for so long. I just thought it was just what you did. And I've realized a long time since that apart from pursuing a life of tasting the 0.0% beers, by the way, Peroni is the best, I've actually worked out along the way that I carried that for such a long time. But when I look back, that there's also a history of alcohol abuse as well in the family. So it's interesting what we carry and where you come from. And that's why I firmly believe that we have all the answers. We just don't ask ourselves the right questions. And if we do, then sometimes we could be really scared of the truth. And I'll probably come on to that later on. And if I don't, nudge me. So, but that survival mechanism in school worked so well that I took that into my corporate life. And I would constantly run. What they don't tell you about things like high anxiety, actually it can generate success by your own definition of the word. That I would work far longer than I had to and start far earlier than I had to. I would be present physically everywhere, but not really mentally. If I was at work, I wanted to be at home. If I was at home, I wanted to be at work. And I see it so clearly now with audiences that I speak to. Some of the, in corporate life, people, construction industry, law industry, lots of high pressure environments. Actually, I see it why people get to that point of breakdown and burnout. And I see it clearly in other people now, but I didn't see it for me. It's because that we don't schedule recovery. We will fill up our diaries with all of our work stuff, then we'll fill up our diaries with all of our home commitments. But actually, where do you feature in your own life? If you looked at your calendar right now, every single day there should be a part of that day that's reserved for you to recharge and to go again. But we don't. And we can only run for so long before we stop. And we will stop. Trust me, from somebody who's been there, we will stop. And you never see it coming. And that sounds like a Liam Neeson kind of trailer, but it's true. You do never see it coming. The other element of why we get to that point is because that we end up masking the situation. We try to be what people want to see in us. We try to be what situations demand of us, but we sure don't damn show ourselves, because when we show ourselves, our narrative tells us we're going to get shot at. Our narrative tells us we're going to be dismissed and judged and not loved and everything else that goes on. And we do. We talk ourselves into that situation, which is why mental health is a taboo subject, which is why maybe even now, but definitely up until recently, people were scared of opening up in the workplace about their challenges that they were going through. When you think about things like breakdown and burnout and stuff, you think it's quite an angry thing. And actually, it's not. The worst thing isn't anger. The worst thing isn't pain. The worst thing actually isn't the frustration. The worst thing is feeling absolutely nothing at all. The worst thing is that you cut off feeling hate, you cut off feeling love, you cut off feeling bad, you cut off feeling good. You can't have one without the other. So for me, the worst thing that's ever happened to me was feeling absolutely nothing. It was living under the haze. It was feeling numb. And for me, I can still get kind of moments of that if I'm in a dip, shall we say. So it's interesting that it's not so much the people that are shouting the loudest that could be struggling. It's the people that are actually just saying nothing. Hence the Ask Twice campaign that happened last year. So my moment, I left a networking meeting. So for those who have never been to a business networking meeting, it's where you go along, pretend to be happy, sell your stuff and eat some breakfast, that kind of stuff. And it was back in the days when you could shake hands. So you would shake hands, say, how are you? I'm great, thanks. How are you? And I really wasn't. But the problem was that we don't tell people. We're so scared of vulnerability. But what I've found since is that when we share vulnerability on a daily basis, we become bulletproof. If you're not showing the world your true self, how do you expect the world to engage with you on your terms? And for me, sometimes the biggest thing is just telling us the truth, is opening up to ourselves. Who are we when no one's looking? So I'd left that networking meeting and I'd lost hope of my conditions and my challenges not ever changing. Interestingly, the environment I had then is the environment I have now. I'm very fortunate. I've got a really loving family and, as I said, an environment, my wife and everything else. But actually, you can have the perfect environment. You can be in the right place, but actually you could be the one that's out of sync. You could be the one that actually is the piece of the jigsaw that's missing. And that's what I found. So I've become very frustrated, the fact that nothing was going to change. I still had all of my old triggers and I basically shut down. As I said, breakdown for me wasn't an angry thing. Burnout for me wasn't an angry thing. It wasn't me slamming my fist on the steering wheel. I just sat in the car and I just shut down like a machine. And I started to sob, I started to cry, and I just couldn't move for 2 or 3 hours. But something really strange happened at that point. It was for the Harry Potter fans in the room. I know there's a lot because I did a show of hands in person in March, and there was a lot of Harry Potter fans. It's like the boggart in the cupboard. Your biggest fear, what would it look like if you started to share that? What would it look like if you let that out? And that's what I started to do. 2 weeks later at the same meeting, I turned up and I told everybody what had happened 2 weeks before. And if I'm honest, without getting too dark about this, it was going to be kind of like, it was either going to consume me or I had to let it out. It was going to be my blaze of glory, mic drop moment, my kind of death by police kind of moment where I was just going to go and say what was really going on with me. And that was it. I had no kind of preconception about what was going to happen from that point. My assumption was saying that everyone was going to judge me and not love me and dismiss me and all that kind of stuff. And 100% it went the other way. That day changed everything for me. That everybody in that room, it's a terrible talk, by the way. I was shaking and crying. It was awful. It's like a brain dump. It's literally a cheap therapy session. It was £12 including breakfast. It was a very cheap therapy session. And I just shared stuff. And firstly, everybody in that room queued up to give me their support. Every single person. I'd never spoken before about any of this stuff. And for me, it was just kind of like a euphoria feeling that people start to really care because you'd shown them what was really going on. The second thing, that everybody gave me a hug. I love hugs. I miss hugs. And the third thing that changed my life forever was that suddenly it wasn't about me anymore. And I think that's what I found, that high anxiety, mental health conditions it can be all consuming. It becomes quite a selfish pursuit, not intentionally by any stretch of the imagination, but it does. It defines us. And it's only when you come out the other side that you see things for what they are. And suddenly it wasn't about me anymore. People that I've known for years, because I'd just given them the brutal truth. The truth is completely liberating. If you want to learn more about someone else, give a little bit more of yourself. And people started opening about all their stuff and telling me, people I've known for years about PTSD and loss and abuse and grief and all this stuff that we carry around. We're just so scared of telling people and showing people. And that's where everything changed for me. That I just saw the dynamic shift, and I saw what I could do to try and help other people to kind of question those things that are going on in their lives. It wasn't about me anymore, and it still isn't. When I tell this story, when I share what I'm going to share shortly, then actually if somebody sees this multiple times, they always get something different from it relating to where they are in their lives at that point in time. Fast forwards, that's what I do now. It's not to say it's a job, but it's been my job since 2016 as a professional speaker doing this. And that's what brought me to Weston College originally for doing an event with Dave Crew, and here I am today. So next slide, Jane, thank you. So where we are right now, I think I kind of adjusted this for the kind of the lockdown edition, as I've called it, because it's important to recognise that there's a lot of people, maybe all people, are acting from a position of fear right now, to some level. I think that over the lockdown period, I think that there was a groundswell of compassion, and most recently that's been replaced with something else, and I'll come on to that. But we need to kind of understand where people are right now, and they're either stuck in acknowledgement mode, in survival mode, or evolution mode. So if you look at lockdown as the example, actually this was kind of like my recovery mechanism from my recovery. So it's worked brilliantly in lockdown, and actually again it's kind of testament to what I said about knowing your kind of plans to change your state. So very early on, I had to acknowledge, like everybody else, that this is brutal. And there's people still now who cannot acknowledge exactly where we are, whether that be personally or professionally. But if I look at the business, for example, as a speaker, as a coach, that all of my business was in person. Every single bit, none of it was online. And actually, so I had to acknowledge very early on, this is going to be brutal in every sense. And it's only when we can acknowledge our problems, our challenges, can we then move on to survival. Because without acknowledgement, we cannot get onto the second step. And if you're trying to help somebody through a process, this very simple process is brilliant. Because once you get into survival mode, even though survival mode creates a lot of anxiety because you're dealing with stuff, for example, in the lockdown example of getting the mortgage breaks, getting the loan breaks, making sure I had enough heart medication, all this kind of stuff. They think, okay, that adage we've all been brought up on, we have what we hold. How long can we last? How long can we survive without potentially any income? How long can we survive in terms of our health? How long can we survive in terms of getting groceries in? All those kind of things that we've never, ever had to question before. Suddenly we're at the front of mind. And there's still people stuck in survival mode. But once you move past survival mode, you can then get into evolution mode. And for me, that's where it started to get exciting. For me, that's where I started to be able to write, okay, I worked out the first two things. I've got a certain amount of time I could do this in. So from a business perspective, I took it all online. From a personal perspective, I just started to add a lot of value in terms of reaching out to different organisations. I did a keynote talk for NHS England, lots of different things I just wanted to do just to get stuff out there and to start helping in the way that I can. The evolution mode is where it started to get exciting. That's the bit where we all started to say that we're kind of forging a new reality. Because the kind of the phrase that was bandied around was, we're all in this together. Personal opinion is we're absolutely not all in this together. We're all in the same storm, but in different boats. We've all got different challenges, different perspectives. And after speaking to the NHS conference, for example, a whole different set of challenges to somebody who's been in isolation for 3 or 4 months, but they're still just as valid. So again, we're all in the same storm, just in different boats. Next slide, please, Jane. So once we moved on from that kind of small process where we can actually work out exactly where we are, then we need to kind of put those things in place. We need to set our boundaries. We need to also manage expectations. So it could be something really, really simple, such as there's an amazing kind of speech by a naval commander. If anybody wants it, let me know. I'll send them the link about the importance of making your bed. And it sounds really kind of simple. But actually what he's saying is if you get up and make your bed in the morning, not only have you achieved something straight away, but you've got whatever happens to you on that day, you've got a neat bed to come back to. And actually from a mental health perspective, if we have things like that in place, I have to be very careful with routines, interestingly, because of the obsessive compulsive tendencies still. But however, with healthy routines, that really helps me. Even simple things like exercising, showering, making sure that you're going into the day still with a positive intent than you would have been going out into the real world. Even that kind of splash of perfume with a splash of aftershave made a real difference because it felt like you're going forward with intent. trust me, over the past 3 or 4 months, whatever it's been, I've seen people in different states of undress and weird positions on Zoom calls and stuff. It's been a very interesting time because a lot of people just roll out of bed and get onto the laptop and roll back again at the end of the day. And I think a lot of from a mental health perspective, a lot of what we can do to make sure that every single day we do something better, to make sure we maintain not just resilience, but also that positive mindset is in the small stuff. It's making sure that I moved my morning run to an evening run. So if I had been sat at a laptop all day, then I've got a run to start to break down the working day. And then when I go back home again, I can then go into my home time, my downtime with energy. So I can purposely enjoy the downtime. Because before that, I was just basically getting wiped out by 8 o'clock and wanted to go to bed. Because I hadn't moved. And simple things like movement on the hour, things like hydration, really, really simple rules. That's on one end of the scale. Then if people are working from home potentially for the first time ever, then making sure that you have some space away from work. That actually, if you are working from the dining room table, then pack all your stuff up away so it's out of sight and out of mind. Not everybody is fortunate enough to have a home office or anything like this. So these little things really do add up. It's daily incremental changes. It's what sports coaches call the marginal gains. If you do something a little bit better every single day, you'll get a lot better at the end of the month. And I think for me, anxiety was regret from the past or fear of the future. Very rarely was it today, which means that Groundhog Day that we've all been experiencing actually is my position of strength. And you see that a lot in people, that when we start to, and I'll come on to assumption in a second, when we start to think too far ahead, that's where anxiety starts to come in. But if you look at public speaking, for example, that Harvard considered public speaking a greater fear than death, that we consider ridicule as a bigger fear than dying. That's the conditioning we're fighting against. So it's no wonder why we do try to keep ourselves away from putting our heads up and not just saying our opinions, but also having the courage to ring fence our own space. So it could be with your students, it could be if you're in employment, it could be with your clients, it could be that you need to manage expectations. What can people expect from you right now, and what can't they expect from you right now? As I said, I work with a lot of accountants that Boris would go on and announce the latest tax breaks, and suddenly their clients were on the phone 60 seconds later saying, right, how do I apply for that? Then they've literally just heard the same press conference as somebody else. Because the expectation is that they are triggered or acting from a position of fear. They expect people to know it straight away. And you would have had those demands placed on you as well. And the final boundary I wanted to mention, and sometimes this can be quite sensitive, is that actually having the courage to speak to the people. Look, I'm guessing that you live with the people that you do because you love them or did once or something. But it's testing the best of relationships, the strongest of relationships. So having the courage to be able to ask for your own space, to be able to ring fence your downtime, to make sure that you recharge and go again tomorrow. And I will come on to that shortly. Next slide, please, Jane. This is Mark Twain, not Albert Einstein, as a lot of people say. So his thing was to never assume that the worst things in my life never actually happened. If you look at public speaking, for example, that anxiety is created in the thought of doing something, but not the doing it. We create anxiety about what we think people are going to say about us, about they're going to heckle us. By the way, if you're looking to speak, that I've spoken at thousands of events and never been heckled once. I'm probably waiting to be proved wrong now, but the point is that we need to start to take away there's a real fear and assumption. We are all bigger picture people, usually, that we like to start with the end in mind, personally and professionally. So, but if the world's greatest minds don't know what the end's going to look like or even when it's going to be, then who are we to take a stab at that? So for me, it's taken away that assumption. Fear is created in the assumption of an outcome because we are trained, we are built to go negative, we're hardwired to look for danger. So taking away the assumption actually makes you realize and actually what is true, right, what is right here in front of you, and also what is manageable. And I think that there's a lot of danger in assumption. It's the same with overwhelm. It's the same with very early on, I started to watch the official government update once a day, and that was it. I mean, whether you believe that's true or not is a whole different presentation. But the point was I switched off news for the rest of the day because actually I found it overwhelming, and most of it was speculation. Most of it was lazy journalism. And it's aimed at creating fear. It was aimed at it kind of whipping up a storm for people to get frightened about. And for me, we just need to stick to the facts. We just need to know what we can do. But as I said just now, is manage those expectations about what people can expect from you right now. Again, personally and professionally. Thanks, Jane. Next slide, please. So this has also been a good time to step back, and still is, by the way, if you're still looking to do these kind of things. It's a great time to be able to review what's good for you and what's not good for you, because you've got a healthy distance away from kind of real life. And as I said, I mean, I personally believe the next time that I'm speaking or coaching in a room which isn't socially distanced, looking at potentially for another year at least. And it unfortunately seems to be backed up by the announcement yesterday from one of the health organisations. So if that's the case, then we have some time to work out how we want our new reality to be. I know that kind of that quote of the new normal has been really overused, but actually it's true. We can get really busy on creating a life on our terms right now. And how this ties in with mental health is actually that, as I said, this is where mental health meets personal development. By delivering talks to students, by delivering talks to whether they be in school or college or university, about actually taking what's going on with the adversity, with mental health challenges and lots of things, you actually can point it in a different direction and get a fantastic result. This is why, for me, I've got a real love-hate relationship with the mental health community on social media, for example, that a lot of people post for inspiration, a lot of people post for desperation, but very rarely in between. Sorry, Jay. For me, it's kind of recognizing that we can use this a lot differently. We can use our challenges to work for us and use that nervous energy, the anxious energy to create something really good. Now, so some of the changes that I've made, I've left Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, which doesn't sound a big deal for a lot of people, but that was huge for me. And also it formed part of my business. There's an educated risk in that as well. But basically, it was negatively impacting my mental health. I mentioned earlier on about there was a groundswell of compassion and it's changed. And I think the change recently is that there's some big world problems going on right now, which is really spilling over into everyday conversation. So for me, the kind of the scrolling thing just was not having a great impact on me at all. So I only now live on LinkedIn and YouTube because it needs to for kind of what I do. But also it seems to be a platform which is far more manageable. So take a step back and work out what's good for you and what's not. Maybe who's good for you and who's not. I mentioned earlier on one of the most powerful exercises you can do, because you do have all the answers, you just don't ask yourselves the right questions. And if you do ask yourselves the right questions, then sometimes we can be afraid of the truth. So what I mean by that is that when I've worked alongside kind of psychologists and lots of different people and different who have the same desired impact as I do, but from different kind of, well, first of all, educated backgrounds and professional backgrounds, that questioning everything that we say and what we do is really important. So wake up tomorrow morning, right, why do you get up at this time? Could you do with more sleep or could you do with less sleep? Or most of the time it's because we've always got up that time or we've always done it that way. Why do you wake up next to them, maybe, is a question you haven't asked in a while. But I throw that one in. I know it's a little bit of a cheeky question. I throw that one in because actually it's a great example of some of the questions we actually ring fence. There's some kind of questions that we consider as a pure belief. We allow it to go unquestioned. And for me, a lot of, if we do have all the answers, a lot of what I try to help people to do is to question everything about them. Everything about us should be open to our own questioning. And as you go out for the day, just question everything you do and also listen to how you speak to yourself as well. The self-narrative thing is so important, and unfortunately not got any time to go into that right now, but self-narrative is huge because actually we can talk ourselves into situations and down from situations. And if you're not feeling good, most of the time we will compound that by the way we talk to ourselves. It's not necessarily how we talk to other people, it's how we talk to ourselves, how it affects our self-worth and our courage and confidence and conviction to go forward. So actually some really simple tweaks about changing how we perceive ourselves to be can have massive impact when you do those daily incremental marginal gains. Next slide, please, Jane. So recovery is huge. A lot of what I talk about is how do we recover. So I'm only going to go into a couple of examples for time's sake. But one of the first things that I didn't realise, and I've always worked in a kind of a client-facing or external role, but really highly anxious at the same time. And I think I actually learned, as soon as I started to speak more and more, I actually learned I'm an introvert, weirdly. Given what I do, I'm an introvert. I recharge in my own company. So that's a true definition for me of an introvert, is I recharge in my own company. So before all this happened, and actually maybe would explain why this is actually okay for me right now, because I'm actually a lot in my own company. But when I was flying and traveling all over the place to speak at different events, that actually I would use traveling as my downtime, as my recovery time. So I would isolate myself. I would always country music, but I would have the music on in my AirPods and stuff, and recharge and manage my state that way. An extrovert recharges in the company of other people. So an extrovert who lives in isolation would be really struggling, and we would need to reach out through Zoom more than somebody who's introverted. But actually, as much as I love what I do, and especially now, obviously with what I'm doing online, that you can get peopled out quite quickly if you're of an introverted nature. So before this, I went for a run, and after this, I'm going to go for a long walk. So it kind of you can start to manage your state. But again, it's just listening to yourself and what's good for you and what's not good for you. Some of the other things to kind of think about is what do you love to do? If I gave you 2 hours now to say, right, here you go, 2 hours, what do you love to do? The one caveat is it's not involving anybody else. It's just for you. What would that be? And most people don't know. Most people don't know what truly lifts their soul. Most people don't know what truly makes them happy, what recharges them. We should know this stuff. We're so busy firefighting, we never actually question what's good for us. What do we actually enjoy? I used to ask that question, what do you love to do when no one's looking? I had some really weird answers, so I did change that question. I'm so glad I did. Next slide, please, Jane. If you're still struggling to think about what really kind of motivates you, I think a great exercise is to think back to that job that you wanted to do as a kid. What was that one thing that you're really emotionally connected to? The most popular answer is an astronaut, weirdly. I say weirdly because an astronaut's a rubbish job. You get trained for 10 years, get shot up into the sky for a week, shot back down at a very high speed with a high risk of death. Probably wouldn't apply for that. But think about the astronaut through the eyes of a teenager before real life kicked in, before mortgages had to be paid and kids had to be fed. Then you've got travel and excitement and discovery and adventure. You get that. You would apply for that time after time. I wanted to be a country singer. The problem is that I can't sing for toffee. My mum says I can, but so does everyone on Britain's Got Talent, which is the problem. I think it's only recently I've actually found my mojo. I've found my place when I've been doing my work as a speaker. I still get the job of traveling and engaging audiences and seeing different places and lots of different things. I get the job of being a singer without the actual singing, which is a bonus for everybody. However, this isn't about changing jobs. HR directors are always really relieved to hear that when I say that. This is about bringing that stuff back into your hobbies now, into your pastimes now, what you are truly about. Because a lot of the time we've just forgotten. We're so busy firefighting, we've lost touch with who we are. And that's a great way, one of the many exercises that I have to start to reconnect with who you are and to bring that back into current day. Thank you, Jane. Next slide, please. So some of you may be in a position of responsibility of other people. And I think there's a real challenge right now. There's lots of challenges right now, but the one in particular, what I found is, given what I do, is that essentially in life, people just want to be heard and they want to be understood. And if you can fulfill those two things to anybody, they will find their own way forward. So unless you're a medical professional, people aren't coming to you to be fixed. They're coming to you to be heard. So our responsibility, as I see it, is to be able to actively signpost, to know the organisations that have already been mentioned on Jane's slides earlier on, to know the organisations that you can signpost people to know what help is at hand within your organisation or within your establishment, and signpost to them as well. And then I think we relieve ourselves of the burden of other people's challenges. And what I mean by that is it's a great intention. The reason why we get into the position of leadership, the reason why you become a mental health first aider, the reason why you get into education and leading the next generation is because you have an empathy, a passion, you have a desire to help people. The problem that comes with that is that naturally we are more sensitive to the burdens of other people. So we can very easily take on the responsibilities and the challenges and adversities of other people right now. So to start with, over the lockdown period, most of the people that I was speaking to was actually kind of like the ground troops, the students and that kind of stuff. And then it changed. It changed from about maybe 4 to 6 week period. Over that period, it changed to people that were in a responsibility of looking after other people. And it made me realize very quickly that who looks after the people that looks after people? Who looks after the people that looks after people? For me, that's the biggest gap as I see it. The biggest gap is supporting mental health first aiders. It's supporting leaders and managers and teachers and people that are in a responsibility of leading other people. It's about increasing self-protection. Where do they go when they need challenges? And for me, that could be the biggest challenge as we go on. Because actually what I feel is that going into lockdown and right up until this point actually has probably been the simplest part. And I think that it's going to be coming away from this point and potentially re-entering that point later in the year, that the biggest challenge still lies ahead. So this stuff that we can do right now is still absolutely valid. You still have that time to work out how you would manage that, how you would help other people without taking that burden on yourself. And again, using the airplane adage, I know it's overused, but it's true. To support other people, to be strong with other people, you need to put your oxygen mask on first. But again, in the UK, we have a real problem about doing that because we believe it's selfish. Self-care is selfish, and it's absolutely not true. Next slide, please, Jane. So, some of the things I like to go into, I'm going to kind of skim through these. So if there's any that really kind of catches you, then please do. Let's have a chat. Letting go and forgiveness are huge. I think that a lot of the time, we hang on to things that have gone. It's what in neurolinguistic programming terms they call emotional anchors. We form emotional anchors to situations, to people, positive and negative. It's the reason why you could be driving along or walking along and you hear a song and it makes you cry or it makes you laugh, that you have an emotional response because you've formed a connection with a person, a situation. And a lot of the time, this negative stuff stays in us, and most of the time, it's only alive in us until we start to let go, we start to forgive. But also, as relinquishing control of other people, we cannot control the uncontrollable, and within that, we cannot control other people. All we truly have control over is how we proactively go into each and every day. So again, it's bringing in the 3 C's. It's boosting the confidence and courage and conviction that you can. And you can do that every single day. Because the first thing that we sacrifice when we struggle is choice. But actually, it's the one thing we genuinely have, is choice. We have choice every single day on how we go forward, given that you cannot control the uncontrollable. For me, it's managing the manageables as well. The 2 biggest changes. So this is from a survey I did with my corporate clients. I'm guessing it's not going to be too far off. The 2 biggest challenges are, in terms of anxiety triggers, are change and procrastination. Change is inevitable. Procrastination, not so much. I think there's always things that we can do that we put off. And a lot of the time we put those things off just because it's just, we don't want to do it. Maybe we don't like the person who's asked us to do it. Lots of different reasons. But actually, when we put off things that we need to get done, it does create a tidal wave of anxiety in your head. And I see that a lot with students that can let workload get on top of them, because they've procrastinated, because they've avoided. And actually, again, if we start to have a project-based kind of system to approaching our stuff, every single one of us, we can then start to make some inroads into managing the manageables. Sharing your challenges, again, this falls in line with vulnerability. It's when we show vulnerability. So this, I have had this conversation with many, as I said, teachers and lecturers before, is that for you to get more out of the people that you're talking to, give a bit more of yourself. If you're having those awkward conversations and people are closing up, then give a little bit more of yourself. And it's amazing what people will share with you. Like I said, I'm the extreme of that, I guess, because I go along and speak and share my stuff and stuff. But the people that share back, maybe for the first time that they've shared anything ever, even one of the speaking academies that I run online now, but I've had people that have actually come out on a speaking academy because they feel that they have a trusted environment to speak, to be heard. And I think that's the power of being in the responsibility of leading other people in any role, is that you can build that trust and the empathy and the rapport so quickly with people by giving a little bit more of yourself. When you do share your challenges, you also learn more about yourself as well. Next slide, please, Jane. So for any Trekkies out there, not going to ask for a show of hands, probably embarrassing for everybody, but I am. This is Jean-Luc Picard of the Next Generation. He is the captain of the Enterprise, and his thing is to engage. We make all of these plans, but do we actually go on them? I see a lot of that. I see a lot of people with fantastic intentions, fantastic ideas, but they haven't got the confidence and the courage and conviction to go forward. When you throw in mental health challenges, when you throw in self-esteem and self-confidence issues, for me, that's where mental health meets personal development. That's the bit where we can start to have a real positive impact with people just by getting those marginal gains every day, getting those daily incremental changes to take people from where they are to where they want to be, not where we want them to be. Next slide, please, Jane. But when we engage wisely. I think especially at the moment, we need to make sure that we immerse ourselves in people and circumstances that nourish us, basically, that don't deplete us. We need to make sure that we stop people pleasing. I think it's a byproduct of struggling, that we will end up, if I ask for a show of hands now, who in the past couple of weeks have said yes to something they want to say no to, guarantee most hands would be up, always the way. But we do that. We give ourselves away to appease other people, to appease other situations, because we haven't got the courage and conviction and confidence in ourselves to be able to make a stand. We need to start to see the value of us without seeking it in the arms of other people. Also avoiding drama magnets, and we've all got those kind of people that tends to be that if you are, especially in a school environment, I was sensitive, because I was labelled as a warrior, and interesting, all these kind of labels that kind of stick around. That I would also be in the same category as respectful or kind, interestingly, because I wouldn't speak up or out against anybody. So I would actually end up, you get people close to you that create a whole load of stuff, and then you're put the centre stage to sort it out. We've all got those kind of people. So be careful not to engage in the dance of the drama magnets, for sure. Social media is a massive one. I go into this a lot when I deliver at educational establishments, because social media is such a huge thing. It is a force for good, but also, as I've experienced too, it can negatively impact us. And that's the call we need to make on things. But it does bring in this FOMO, this fear of missing out, that we feel that we're not living as well or as good as other people. But the truth is that, and by the way, we've always had that. So I'm 42, as I said, so we've always had that. Growing up, it was keeping up with the Joneses. You compare your car against their car, their house against your house, and their garden against your garden. If my dad got a mower out on Sunday morning, every person in that street got a mower out on a Sunday morning. So we always had that. The problem is now it's online, is you're comparing your spun version of the truth against somebody else's spun version of the truth. But the reality is, whoever you surround yourself with, online or offline, you're the average of those people. So we need to be really careful how we engage and who we engage with, because it has an ultimate effect on us. Next slide, please, James. And when we take something on, when you see other people take stuff on, it's so big and hairy and scary that it becomes daunting. It becomes something which is intimidating. For me, I think the biggest thing we can do for people, if it's not you, for somebody that you know, for somebody that you position a responsibility for, So make sure that you can break it down into chunks for them, break it down into things that are achievable. And I know I keep saying this, but it's so true that the true progress comes from daily incremental progress, whether that be recovery from breakdown, whether that be from mental illness, mental health, whatever that may be. It's daily incremental changes that make a huge difference, because slowly over time you start to have that kind of impact on yourself, which is not only lasting, but it's strong. It's really deep rooted. And from a neurological perspective, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that between 21 and 28 days to form a new habit strong enough neurologically to start to replace your old conditioning. It's to start to replace. So actually, if you look at weight loss with myself, as I mentioned earlier on, that it's no real surprise that I would get maybe a few days in and then think, oh, I've been bad now, check the terminology, the narrative, and then I'll just write the rest of the week off, for example. But what we tell ourselves is really interesting, because we can tell ourselves something enough for it to be true. I run every day now, but for 4 years ago, I actually said to myself, when I lose weight, I'll start running. If I would have started running 4 years ago, I would have lost the weight. But I told myself enough for it to be true. And scarily, we can do that. We can convince ourselves of anything if we tell ourselves enough. But because we're hardwired to look for danger, the most of the time we're talking ourselves into problems. So we need to start to retrain our brain. It's what I call setting out on a mission to prove yourself wrong. Brain hacks, I think, is really important. Next slide, please, Jane. So this is Excel London when it wasn't a Nightingale Hospital, unfortunately. And I speak here maybe 4 or 5 times a year for different conferences and events. And I put this in because 5 years before this was taken, I was actually being carted out with St. John's Ambulance after having a panic attack. So for anybody who has been to trade shows or conferences, it's the bit where you go around trying to nick goodie bags off of stands when they're not looking. And this poor soul, this poor sales guy, I hope he's all right now, I never did find out, he just caught my eye, and I had a full-on panic attack as an attendee. And when I think back to those days when I was walking around, check the narrative, I would say to myself, I could never do that when I looked at the side speakers. I could never do that, actually stand on a table and talk to people all day. Or I could never do that, definitely never do that looking at the stage speakers. But within 5 years of doing what I do and the stuff that I've kind of really skirted over today, of changing the narrative, of retraining and brain hacks, all these kind of things that I've just learned through my own personal development, through reading loads, watching loads and learning loads and being an observer of life. Within 5 years, I was booked a keynote on my own right, and now consistently 5 or 6 times every year. And it's a relatively short space of time. So the message here is just to say that wherever you feel, if you feel that something is unachievable, then it will be, as long as you keep telling yourself it is. That you can use that same nervous energy to drive you to do that thing you want to do, whatever that may be. And I think for me, sometimes it's when people lose hope, or the hope of something better, that it really starts to become quite dangerous. It's hope is the one thing that keeps everybody going, or the hope of something better. Next slide, please. And as a country music fan, I always try to finish on a country music quote, one that isn't about losing your dog or your missus or something. This is every storm runs out of rain. And for me, it really ties nicely in with the message of hope. But also, we often feel, and actually maybe right now is a perfect example of that, who knows whereabouts in this storm we are. We just don't know. But it will pass. It always has and it always will. Every problem you've ever been through, you've at least survived through because you're here. But most of the time you thrive through. Most of the time you've learned something from the experience. So every storm will run out of rain. And maybe you need to know that right now, just to kind of keep on doing what you need to do. Acknowledging that you could be in acknowledgement mode or survival mode or evolution mode, and seeing where you are along that way and try to push yourself on to the next step. But I know a lot of you will be in a position where you care and help and teach other people. And maybe they're coming to you right now. And for me, hope is the biggest message we can give people. It's knowing that they're not coming to you to be fixed, as I said, unless you're a medical professional or in a position of professional treatment, but they're coming to you to be heard. They're truly heard. So put down the phone, truly listen to what they're saying, to what the challenges are, and then actually get good at active signposting. Now, out of every kind of sphere of walks of life that I speak in, education seems to be the best at signposting. They know where to send people, they know where to help people, to guide people, and they have the things in place. So for me, it's kind of like hand holding, I guess. It's just actively listen to people and help them find their own way forward. And it is their own way forward. Next slide, please. So that's me. Thank you very much for joining today's session. Given the sensitivity of the subject, sometimes questions can be a little thin on the ground. I stand to be corrected because sometimes it does change. So if you do want to ask me any questions privately, please do. I'm always happy to hear from people. So it's nick@nickelston.com. Got a very active YouTube channel and also available. I'm also on LinkedIn only now, not on the other channels as well. But thank you very much for listening to me. I'm now going to do the introverted sigh and a swig of drink. So yes, I'm going to hand back to Jane. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. We do have a number of questions and observations and comments, really. So I just wondered whether I could read some of those out to you and you could kind of give your response to them, if that's okay.
Of course. Yes, of course.
Lovely. So first of all, somebody from the put into the chat function that they wished that senior managers understood about what you've talked about today. They themselves suffer from anxiety and depression, but also have a number of learners that suffer from mental health and depression. And they find it very difficult to get senior managers to recognise that and support them and their learners. I know you've worked in a lot of big corporates. I just wonder if you could share maybe some of your experiences of getting senior leadership on board.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's a great point, a great question. So I always use law firms as a great example of this, that when you look at kind of partners, the kind of the senior management, they will be the last people to engage at the event with what I'm talking about, but the first people to approach me afterwards. And it's for the same reason, is that we've been conditioned to not show vulnerability, especially in a professional environment. And I think for me, it's encouraging people to know that it's okay, which is actually easier from the ground down, from the management down. When it's the other way, it's difficult to change that environment, to change that culture. It's getting better. But I think you need to acknowledge that they will experience the same things as you. They just may not be free enough to open up about it. And I think that's a culture change, not an individual change. But it's a tough one. Yeah, I do understand that. It is a tough one. I think that it is changing. I know when I'm walking into an organisation which is doing this as a tick box exercise, and I know when I'm walking into an organisation which has a passion for positive culture change. But the one thing I can say is that the challenges are widespread. It's our vulnerability levels which differ. So it could be a case somehow trying to engage them with sharing a little bit more of themselves.
Thank you, Nick. We've actually had a number of comments about lockdown in particular from a number of attendees. So people finding it difficult with kind of their own routines, and if they don't keep to a set routine and be on the laptop by a certain time in the morning, or that they find their anxiety levels are increasing. Do you have any, again, you've been working with a lot of organisations during lockdown, do you have any tips on how to manage anxiety working from home?
Yeah, so I think the assumption thing is huge. I think generally it's coming back to managing expectations. Is that if genuinely, for whatever reason, if you have to be online at a certain time, for example, and that's a challenge for you, it's having the courage to show the vulnerability to explain why that may not be possible. I think that increasing the elements of things like movement and hydration always helps as well. But I think generally it's really difficult, actually, because different people are in different situations. If you need to be online at a certain time, it's difficult for you. Definitely open up about that. But I think it's about having the courage to manage expectations, whether that be from a personal point of view or professional point of view. And there's no real easy answer to that, unfortunately. The lockdown is kind of bringing out the best and worst in people, but I think it's also showing that people are operating from a position of fear. So it's kind of allowing some compassion, maybe even back to them as well, and having the courage to explain if something isn't possible as well. That's a tough one, actually. And if that person who asked the question wants to follow up with me afterwards, I'll have more time to give it some thought. So I would like to. On my YouTube channel, there is a lockdown specific video that I did produce, which is freely available. So that might be worth checking out as well, because I've got a mental block right now, for being honest with you.
Yeah. No, but actually, Nick, if you could share that, we'll put it in with the recording and the email we send after. And
Sure.
Actually, there's been some quite interesting comments in the chat, and maybe what we could do is produce a kind of a top tips afterwards and send that to people, because I do think there's a lot that we could unpick here. Somebody asked whether being some people overwork to mask their own anxieties in a similar way to using alcohol to mask anxiety, and the fact that they work all the time can help keep their mind occupied. I'm assuming you've seen that as well.
Yeah, and look, you know me, Jane, I'll always be honest that I had to take a week off last week because I was starting to struggle. The great thing about going through challenges before is you not only become very self-aware, but you also have the courage just to kind of make the change when you need to. And I was doing exactly that. I was actually using work and what I do as a distraction, and actually wondering why I was so burnt out at the end of it. And it was masking something else that was going on. But it's only when we take a step back and we see things for what they are. But again, it's fighting everything in us. I mean, it seems like a silly example, but it makes the same point. So I was doing a stadium event last year, and the MacBook that I use for slides and stuff that I use all the time, I couldn't remember the password. The password that I enter 50 times a day, I couldn't remember the password for it. And whilst I stayed in that position, that I couldn't remember it, but by taking a step back for 30 seconds, I went back in and remembered it straight away. And I had to do that last week. And I'll be completely honest with you, that it took until Friday for me to be able to relax properly. That's how much stress we can carry that without even thinking so much about it. So I think that I don't like to see distraction techniques as what they are. I like to see it as a question and exercise to work out what's going wrong for you to have to do that. So, for example, by taking a step back from alcohol, for example, I realised exactly when I would abuse alcohol. When I worked out why that was, I could then start to address those things. It's kind of like with you're kind of treating the symptom and you're not treating the problem. And I think that's the problem, is that we need to start digging down into the actual problem, because the byproducts, the symptoms, aren't actually the challenges. I think the challenge is the stuff that causes those things.
Thank you, Nick. We've got a few more questions, so if you're okay to
carry on.
So we also have had a question about how do you avoid showing vulnerability as being interpreted as moaning?
Well, that's a great
question. I guess
question.
when you're speaking to managers, yeah.
So I think that vulnerability is not necessarily moaning. I think that could be the way that you could perceive what you're trying to say. So I think vulnerability for me, if something was troubling me, I'm trying to think of an example on the fly that I can. If something was troubling me, that for me, vulnerability would say to somebody, this is what's happening, this is how I feel about this thing, and this is what I feel could change. What do you think? So you firmly declared your intention. For me, that's vulnerability, is that it's not just about telling them the problem. You're actually being vulnerable enough to share a potential solution and how it's making you feel. So I think that's the difference. Whereas moaning would be, oh, I hate this, I don't want to do this no more. And actually then you will get the response that would kind of warrant, really. But if you were, vulnerability to me is, I don't show vulnerability just to show vulnerability. It's to prove a point, or it's to make a point, or it's to make a change. that I think vulnerability we need to look at as a strength and not a weakness. And I think as soon as you have that perception shift, you can start really making the case for the changes you want to have made. Because it forces people to give you a justified reason back as well. Because if I said to you, I don't know, say, oh, I'm not happy with this coffee, it's terrible, then people will just get defensive about that. Well, go and get the other coffee then, that kind of stuff. But actually say, if I don't know this coffee, but actually I think this one would be a lot better, and actually this, I think it's going to make everyone a bit happier if we've got some decent coffee in here. Okay, that's cool. They've got to then justify, well, that's not reasonable. But I think a lot of the time when we show, if we think about vulnerability, we can get quite sensitive and quite defensive about it. So we'll get quite flustered. So for me, if I use the example of saying yes to people we want to say no to, it's really difficult to start saying no to people, especially because most of the time they're like family or close people, aren't they? So it's really difficult to do that. So you need to kind of take that step back. Always think about taking that step back. So it could be that, can you do this for me? I'm going to have to get back to you. And then 2 minutes later, phone back, actually, no, I can't. Sorry. You've given yourself that step back and you feel stronger enough to say it. So I think always consider it as a step back, come from a position of strength. And when you're showing vulnerability, show it with intent. Show it with where you're kind of outlining what you want to try to achieve with what you're sharing. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think that's for me the quote of today, actually. Vulnerability is a strength and not a weakness. And actually we've had a few people put in the chat that they can really recognize their own behaviors, and there's a lot of sort of alarm bells ringing in what you're saying. So I think actually that shift in how you view vulnerability and your own vulnerability and how you communicate that is so important.
I do a talk for. I've done a talk for students before, where it's called Vulnerability to Bulletproof. That it's trying to get people to see that actually, I wouldn't say it's cool, but actually it's okay to start to show vulnerability. But because actually, the very least, that everything's out there. No one's got anything on you. It's just unashamedly you, and then you can. And I think it gives you that inner confidence and belief in yourself, which we lack. We seek it in other things or in other people and other situations.
We've had another question, Nick, about you very kindly and openly shared your experience of your own breakdown earlier on. How did you pick yourself up? Did somebody else pick you up, or did you recognise it and pick yourself up afterwards? How was that managed?
So I would, if I'm honest, I think it was self-motivated. I think it came from a point of frustration that it kind of created in me the catalyst to change. That being said, that like my wife's amazing, that my family, I had to be honest with my family, just saying, look, if I'm gonna, I've always been quite open about this in terms of saying, look, if I start to, I don't know, things that I used to do, like check on different things, or if I start seeking accountability or reassurance or something, like just reassure me once and then stop, kind of thing. So you kind of set, again, it's managing expectations, it's setting the ground rules, that if you need to make a positive change, you will need to bring people on board potentially, if they're strong, kind of healthy relationships, which I'm really fortunate they are.
Thank you. I'm going to the Q&A now, and we've had a number of questions in there, if that's okay. The first one is, how do we know? So I think you made a comment earlier in your presentation about the Brits are the most hesitant around self-care. The question is, how do we know that? Is there any data that we capture as a country and compare against others, or
there's no national data. That's data that I collect from clients, from audiences. So yeah, there's no national data that I can share on that, but it's just purely from audience surveys and feedback forms and that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
And I think that the evidence, I mean, when you start to speak to people about this, you see this a lot in kind of like most people you speak to, if they were starting to, I don't know, ring fence some time for themselves or to put themselves above other people, they would automatically throw in the word guilt. They would feel guilty about doing that. And I think that kind of really emphasizes that point, that we do feel bad for putting ourselves first a lot of the time.
Just actually, someone's just put in the chat that there's a really good book, you might know it already, Nick, called Dare to Lead by Bernie Brown. And it's all
Brené
about
Brown, yes.
yeah, all about leadership and showing vulnerability as a leader is a strength and not a weakness. So that's
absolutely agreed.
top
And
tip
I
there.
think, yeah, and I think it's on Netflix as well now. I think.
Might be
If you
checking that one
prefer
out.
if you prefer your watching than reading, but yeah.
Another question is, what if what you're doing is affecting negatively your relationship with others? So, i.e., you mentioned earlier about wanting to spend time by yourself. I guess it's that introvert extrovert thing. How can you manage that so that you're not impacting negatively on others around you?
This is a big question, and there's lots of caveats to this. Generally, as a general rule of thumb, if you were to have half an hour to yourself every day, which isn't unreasonable, then I wouldn't consider that should be a problem for anybody. Really, the problem you have is that, and it tends to be the people you're closest to. It could be your close friends as well. That when you start to make life changes, and actually that is, I mean, having that kind of courage and confidence and conviction to stand up and ask for what you want. When you start to make these big life changes, actually it can unsettle a lot of people. Is kind of what's been described as a snow globe effect. Is when you start to shake things up, you need to wait for the dust to settle before people know where things are. Then, because if you've kind of like, it's usually they'll make themselves clear. They say, "Oh, damn, you've changed." Yeah, you're damn straight I've changed. I'm saying no to you now. That kind of stuff. People will recognise the changes in you, and I think that if it's because people have got used to dealing with you on certain terms, they've got used to dealing with you being a certain way, and if you're going to change that, then actually you're going to need to give them time to get used to the differences, to the change. So there is a give and take on this. So for me, it's about kind of taking people on that journey with you where you can.
Thank you.
I must say that I would feel amiss to say that it can actually sometimes be, we could be potentially be in the wrong place. Because like I said, and that's from kind of both sides of any party, I mean professionally or personally, of course, we could actually be just be in the wrong place, because if you've not been if you've been somebody else, or if you've not been you for a long time, then obviously people have got used to that as well. So yeah, that's a really difficult one, and it's really broad. And if anybody wants to talk about that in further depth, please do give me a shout, because it's too big a subject for a couple of minutes, unfortunately.
Thank you, Nick. Another question. How can you let go and forgive? It's really easy to say that, but very difficult to do.
It is. So the good thing, right, depends how fluffy you want to go on this, because I'm a big fluffy guy. So I use something called affirmations. So affirmations are statements of intent as if they were true. So in the US, they're called mantras. I think they also use the term affirmations as well. So it's kind of one of those things where you tell yourself something which is true. So I forgive me, I forgive them, and you say this on repeat. So it forms part of your daily self-care process. So if you've got a challenge right now where you're struggling to forgive somebody or something, then the good news is you don't have to be in front of that person or that event to have to let go of that. A lot of the time, and it has to be said, a lot of the time, these things that we ruminate on, they've long since forgotten us, and it only stays alive in us. So again, it's another great brain hack, and actually it forms part of that habit building process that every single day you say, I forgive me, I forgive them, I forgive that. But to start with, it sounds stupid. You don't feel it, but you keep on doing that, and actually it does start to settle a lot more. I've actually had to use that a lot recently myself, actually. So for me, it works really well. But if you feel silly doing it to start with, that's absolutely right. I felt silly doing it to start with as well. But the more you do this, it puts you in a more positive frame of mind, and it starts to let go of the situation that you're holding on to. But definitely know that most of the time, these things are long gone in everyone and everything apart from ourselves.
It's like mindfulness as well. It's not easy to begin with, but it becomes easier as you check in and as
Exactly.
you practice it. So I guess it's the same with affirmations as well. The more you do it, the easier it becomes.
Exactly, and I mean, over lockdown, I've been practicing meditation properly now. I've done it kind of loosely for a while, but actually properly. And I started just with 3 minutes a day, and I was thinking, like, oh, this is a waste of time. And actually now it's like 20 minutes a day, and I'm feeling really, really good for it. So I think it's a case of it's not going to do you any harm, so try it. I think there's definitely an element of that.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And the last question, Nick, how did you yourself change your self-narrative?
So first of all, that's a great question. Some great questions. I should have had coffee before I came on. So the self-narrative is actually, that's a lot easier. So I used journaling a lot at the time. So I would write down exactly how I felt about certain things, especially around things that made me highly emotional. So I was quite openly, I was a very jealous, insecure person. In every form of relationship, in like sexual, friends or family, whatever they may be, I was very insecure and seeking my accountability in other people. So when something like that flared up, I would write it down, or something made me angry, or something that I was anxious about. But I would write down in exactly what I was telling myself. And I went back 2 weeks later. I always made a note to go back 2 weeks later. And on day one, there was 128 entries on day one when I first started doing this, and none of it happened. So actually, over a while, you start to prove to yourself that actually the stuff that you tell yourself is just not, it's not true. It's a spun version of the truth. So in terms of, that's definitely one way of going about it, I think, is to check that narrative. I always remember an amazing conversation I had. It was actually at a BBC panel event with a psychologist about how we talk to ourselves in terms of the first person and the third person. So if you're not feeling life right now and you say to yourself, I am rubbish, that's absolutely you. It's first person, you're saying that, and that's something you can deal with. But most of the time we will say to ourselves that you are rubbish to ourselves. And actually, when you speak to yourself in the third person, the reality is that's what somebody else has told you, but also told you enough for it to become your conditioning, to be part of you. It's the reason why people think that comfort zones are comfortable, but actually there's a reason why people stay in toxic relationships, personally or professionally. It's because actually it's harder to, it's easier to stay in a position of pain and frustration than it is to do something about it. So it's understanding that things like narrative and how we talk to ourselves plays a huge part. And understanding that comfort zones aren't necessarily comfortable. And when we start to move away from where we are to where we want to be, it's going to take a lot of like daily recovery, the daily recharging, all the stuff I talked about earlier on. It's going to take a lot of energy. Like I said, there's not 1 week goes by where on a Friday I'm exhausted because I'm delivering emotion all the time. Now, that's my thing. That's my passion. That's what I've decided to do with that. But be a lot easier to do something else. But because I recognize that, I can throw an extra recovery and extra recharging.
We've had a really good question, which I think a lot of us can relate to. It's about, do you have any advice about imposter syndrome?
Sorry for laughing. I still get that. Who am I to be doing this? How the hell did I get here? That kind of stuff. For me, and I had to do this last week, as I said, it's part of my week off. It wasn't just to kind of chill out and watch Netflix all week. It was, I needed to review. I needed to kind of take stock. It's really easy to start to beat yourself up, especially when your energy is low for whatever reason, whether that be mental health or self-esteem, self-confidence. And there were 3 things that happened to me the week before, which really knocked me. And the way that I come back from that was I had 3 different situations where people told me things that were positive and pivotal in their lives that was instigated by something I had said. So I think sometimes we need to review actually the good we do. It's the same with good news. Good news is never publicized. Bad news is publicized all the time, but no one ever really reports good news. So I think it's the same with us. We can very easily beat ourselves up. It's easier to beat ourselves up for the stuff we've done wrong. But start to look at the stuff you do well. start to look at the lives that you positively impact. And if there has been something which you feel that is not been a great part of your life, then actually use that as the catalyst for change. Use that as the lesson, learning to actually get to where you want to be. Because as I said, it's just energy. It's the same with anxiety and excitement. It's the same with everything, that if you channel it in a different direction, you can have a different result. Imposter syndrome is really challenging, but it's because we're not used to absorbing the positive stuff about us. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Well, Nick, thank you so much for today. We've had some fantastic feedback in the chat. Comments like really relatable, and some fantastic, which we will share with you, but lots of really positive feedback. Just before we go, I just wanted to let you know that there's the last in our regular series of webinars for the SEND Centre on the 29th of July. What we'll do after today's webinar is send links to Nick's YouTube channel and the recording for today and some other things that we've mentioned, then if you've got any questions or you want any further information on anything, then please get in contact with us. But Nick, from everybody, thank you so much for your amazing presentation today, and I've just seen one of the best webinars they've ever been on. So thank you, Nick.
Oh, wow.
Really, thank you, and for continue to support us. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. It's always good to work with you guys. Thank you. Nice to meet everybody as well.